So like Pastor David said, today we're going to be looking at the Bible overview. And specifically, I'm going to be focusing on this idea of redemption, how this Bible is actually all one story from Genesis all the way to Revelation. It's not 66 different stories across 66 different books. It's actually one united, one story. But I want to ask you guys, why did you come here today? Why do you want to learn about Bible? Did you come because Pastor David said to come? So why did you come today? It's okay. If that's true, it's okay. Well, hopefully you came today because you're curious. If you're curious, then hopefully you'll enjoy this lecture. Yeah. But just a little introduction to who I am. Yeah, like my name is Brandon. I'm 28 in Korea, I guess. So I was born in 1998, and I was born in New Orleans, Louisiana, which, if you know jazz music, then you know my hometown, because my hometown is the hometown of jazz music as well. But please do not ask me if I like jazz, because the answer is no, I do not. I actually play the saxophone, but I don't like jazz, because I grew up hearing it every single day. Yeah. And then I actually studied neuroscience and English literature as my first degree, actually, because at the time I really wanted to study science, because I believed that science was the answer to everything, that every question of life could be answered if we understood science. Therefore, I studied science. But in 2018, I actually became a Christian, suddenly. I was visiting my sister in Hawaii, where she lived, and she works for the same organization that I work for now. And at that time, I encountered who God really is. We were in a worship event one night, and I looked at my sister, and I said, oh no, God is real. I have an issue, I need to know him now. And so since 2018, I've been with Youth with a Mission, or YWAM for short. I was in Cambodia for 6 years, in the border of Cambodia and Thailand. And so I really love Southeast Asia. And I've been to Myanmar also, very beautiful country, yeah. So I really love Cambodia. And then I've been in Korea since beginning of 2024. So it's been about 1.5 years now. And I work with Youth with a Mission also here in Busan as well. And my main focus is urban ministry. And so I work a lot with local churches and mission outreach teams and things like that. And our main focus is to do basically what I'm here doing today. It is to equip the young generation with the tools they need to live out the calling that God has on their life. And so whether that's Bible or just simple discipleship, things like worship, hearing God's voice, whatever it is, that's my calling, and that's what I like to live my life for. And so that's a little bit about me. Yeah. But I also studied, international business when I was in Cambodia as well. Yeah. So I want to ask you guys, how do you guys view the world? What is the world? Why are we here? What is our purpose? Any thoughts? Do you think, before I said that I thought science was the answer to everything. Do you guys also believe science is the answer to everything? Maybe? Well, not sure. Pastor David, how do you view the world? Yeah, so through your own experiences and through a biblical worldview, you look at the world. Interesting. Anybody else? How do you view the world? Do you think there's one story or one thing that kind of lays the foundation of the entire world? So there's actually a few different views of the world that we can look at. Of course, there's more, but one of the first ones we can look at is pluralism, which basically means the universe just simply exists. There's no specific reason why we live. There's no reason the world was created. We're just here. Life really has no meaning. We just have to live it. That's pluralism, okay? And then the second one is the Enlightenment theory. And this is the one I kind of believed in before. Basically that humans, we live on this earth, and through science, through technology, we can conquer, we can rule the earth, and we can use it for all that it's worth. And through science, technology, our own desires, our own will, we can make the world a better place. It's very much, I'm human, and I'm in control of everything. But then we also have some different religious perspectives, right? Like we know Muslims believe in the Quran, which says that Allah is the creator of everything, and that ultimately he will receive victory through his creation, right? But we're in a church, and so in general, we typically have a more biblical worldview, right? But what does a biblical worldview actually mean? When you said you view the world through a biblical worldview, through a biblical perspective, what do you mean by that? So do you view the Bible as a set of rules or guidelines we have to follow?
Yes.
Oh, you do? Interesting. Okay. Is that how you guys view the Bible? That it's a book of law, a religious book that we just have to follow? I think we can view the Bible this way. Yes, I agree. The Bible does teach us how we're meant to live. But I also don't want us to limit the Bible to some simple religious book, to just a set of laws, of rules, of regulations that we have to follow, right? Because as Christians, we believe that God is a living God. The Bible is not some book written by somebody who is dead and therefore no longer cares if we read it or if we follow it. The Bible was inspired by the voice, the Spirit of God, right? And is meant to show us how we're meant to live our lives. And so I don't want us to view the Bible as some simple religious book, you know? I want us to view it as the history of the world, that we can see in the book of Genesis that God created everything. And then we ultimately see the very end of the Bible in the book of Revelation that God will one day restore the world back to the perfect creation that he created at the very beginning, right? And so the Bible isn't some simple book of laws, of regulations. Yes, it does show us how we're meant to live. It shows us how we're meant to view the world. But more importantly, it shows us the story that God is writing, the story that is still being written and that we're part of today. And so, yeah. Why I'm saying all that is because simply the way we understand human life depends on what conception we have of the human story. What is the real story of which my life is part? And so if we follow the Enlightenment theory, then that just means we're here to discover science and we're meant to take control of the world through our own ability. If we believe in the Quran, it means that we need to follow Allah and what the Quran teaches us about the history of the world. But if we're Christian, and if we believe that God is a living God, then we have to view the Bible as a history of the world. That what we are, who we are, our identity, our calling, our purpose can be found by understanding the Bible and living it out. And so the Bible is not some simple story that we can just read and just follow blindly that, oh, the Bible says this, so I have to do it. But really, the Bible is a story. It is a book that we are still part of. And so I don't want us to see the Bible that it's just something simple, but instead, we must not simply be spectators who watch the story of the Bible take place, but instead, we must be active participants in the story that God is still writing. Does it make sense? Not too fast? Not too fast? Okay. So, like we talked about, today we'll be talking about God's redemptive plan. But what does redemption actually mean? Who can tell me the definition of redemption in your own words? What does it mean to redeem something? How do you describe redemption in your own words? Yeah, so redemption, in order to redeem something, it means something had to have been lost. Something had to have been broken, right? And so when I say the story of God's redemptive plan or God's redemption, it means that there was something lost, there was something broken that through Jesus, through us even today, God is trying to restore to something new once again. That there was something original that was perfect, that was good, but something happened, something went wrong, and we're trying to go back to that perfection that was originally there. And so we can see a basic summary of God's redemptive plan. Can somebody read this out loud for us? And so I might use some kind of slang here and there. So OT, Old Testament. NT, New Testament. GRP, God's redemptive plan, okay? And so like it says that in the beginning, they were in the garden, everything was perfect, but suddenly evil came in and corrupted it. It broke the perfect image that God had created. And that through God's redemptive plan, we can see two different things, two different ways he works. The first being what we call big R's. There are these big redemptive stories, these big redemptive acts of God. And so, for example, we can look at different covenants or promises that God makes between himself and his people, between himself and us even today, right? We can also see a foreshadowing or these glimmers, these pieces of hope in the Old Testament of the coming Messiah, the coming Jesus who will come to restore the world back to the perfect image that God had. And obviously, the biggest R of the Bible is, we can see through the Gospels, is the coming of Jesus, the answer, the redemptive answer to all that was broken, right? But it's not just big R's, right? It's hard for us to be involved with these things, right? Because they're such big events. We can't be Jesus, can we? Jesus already came. We can't do that also. So instead, we can see these little R's, these little acts, these little pieces of redemption that we get to partner with God in, right? And so we can see God working through the lives of individuals throughout the Bible, for example. He works through people like Moses and, who else did I write? Joseph, Joshua, Abraham, Mary, the mother of Jesus. He works through these different characters of the Bible and even through each one of us today to bring his redemption to its fullness. And so God working through situations to bring restoration of worship with him can also be these little R's. So it's not just the big pieces like Jesus, it's also the little R's, the little pieces of redemption that God is doing throughout history through his people. Now the Bible covers about how many years? About 4,000 years of history, right? It's a very big book. And there's 66 books, right? And so if you look here, you can kind of see a basic outline of where all the different books of the Bible actually fall within history. And so we know Genesis is the first book, and so it was written about 4,000 BC. So about 4,042 or 6,000 years ago. Yeah, 6,000 years ago. And then all the way to Revelation, it was written about 2,000 years ago, give or take, right? And so the Bible is a very, very long history book covering over 4,000 years of history. And so there's a lot to unpack. And unfortunately, we cannot unpack everything in our seminar this time. But if you want to know more, feel free to read the Bible some more. It's a good book. I recommend it, really. It's a really good book. But this can be really hard to digest, right? There's a lot of stuff happening. And so we can simplify the Bible into these kind of 4 different pieces. So we can call this God's redemptive framework of the Bible. So first we have creation, and then we have the fall. And by the fall, I mean when sin entered the garden that day and man was pulled away from communion or relationship with God. They fell away from God, right? And then we can see redemption through the life of Jesus, that he comes and he restores the people. But in this period of redemption, we're still waiting for the fullness, right? Like we still live in a world that is broken. We still live in a world tainted and corrupted with so much sin and evil. And so we're still waiting for the 4th part of this story to happen, right? This new creation. Like she already shared, redemption means a new creation, something new, right? And so we're waiting for that new creation to come. Everybody following? Makes sense? No questions so far? My talking isn't too fast? Okay. And so we can go a little bit deeper now. And so this is kind of the structure for the actual teaching portion for today. And so we'll start with creation, right? We can see God creating everything. And then we'll move on to this amazing man named Moses who lived 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years ago. And then we'll move into the period of Judges where the people keep going through the cycle of sin and repentance and sin and repentance. And then we see the kings and prophets. And then ultimately we'll see Jesus. And then the church age that we're currently living in. We'll look at the letters of Paul a little bit and even the writings of John, such as Revelation as well. Have any of you guys read the Bible from beginning to end before? Yes? Who's read it from beginning to end, all 66 books? A couple of you guys? It's okay. Back in 2018, I took a Bible school, and the teacher asked the first day of the school, who's read the Bible? I could not raise my hand, really. I think I had read only the book of John and the book of James, maybe. And so it's okay. If you haven't read the Bible yet, it's okay. Hopefully, this will help you have a better foundation to help you get into the Bible and enjoy it a lot more. One of my favorite things is when students tell me, the Bible's so boring. I don't understand it. But then when they have this foundation, they get to see the picture of God's history, then they can come back and they tell me, actually, the Bible is alive. I can see it in 3D now. And so that's really my hope for you guys, that as you engage more with the Word of God, it comes to life, because the Bible tells us that the Bible, the Word of God, it is live and is active, right? And so I want us to be able to also see the Bible in the same way, that it's not just simply a book, but it is living, it is the Word of God. Okay. And so let's jump into the first section of the Bible. And so the book of Genesis, which is the first book of the Bible, it outlines the creation story. But one important thing we need to understand about every single book of the Bible is that it was not written to us. None of the books of the Bible were written to us, okay? Genesis was written to the Israelites, the people who had been in exile in Egypt for like 400 years. And so the Bible was written to people thousands of years ago. Therefore, the Bible sometimes is really hard to understand because we have a different history, we have a different culture, we have a different mindset, right? And so when we read the creation story, I want us to be thinking about the original readers, that it was written to those Israelites who had left Egypt and were in the wilderness. They were on the way to a land that God had promised them. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry. We'll talk about it as we go through the stories today. But ultimately, through Genesis, the first book of the Bible, they needed to understand who God is. Just like I asked you early, how do you view the world? The Israelites at this time, they also were asking that question. What is the world? Why are we here? Why was the world created? And through the book of Genesis, these people were given their answer, that we were created by a creator. We did not just somehow appear one day. We didn't come from bacteria or an amoeba or anything like that, but instead we were uniquely and individually created by a God, a divine creator who is overseeing all things. And so in Genesis 1:16, for example, we see the description, this story of how the sun and moon were created. But one interesting thing is it doesn't say the sun and moon, right? It doesn't use our words. It says there was a greater light and a lesser light. The reason why the author describes it like this is because in their culture, the Israelite culture, which you guys know Egyptian culture, right? They had many gods. They actually viewed the sun and the moon as gods. But through the creation story here in the book of Genesis, what we see is that these pieces of the universe, the sun and the moon, they're not gods, they're just simply lights in the sky that was placed by a divine creator, right? And so we can see here that the author is beginning to shape their worldview, beginning to shape their perspective and show them that these things are not gods, but there's actually a creator, the one you're supposed to actually worship. And so we can see that everything is created, right? And the book of Genesis, we see first, that there was nothing, but then there was night and day, and then God separated the land from the water, and then he created, plants, and then he created animals, and then lastly, he creates man. And when he creates man, he creates them very, very uniquely. God doesn't spend time with any other creation. There's nothing in the Bible that said that God, was holding hands with a tree or talking to a bear or a fish or anything like that. But God's relationship with man starts from the creation of man. That while God spoke the rest of creation into life, he says, let there be light. Let the waters and the land be separated. We can see that he actually takes the dust, right? And he forms man. And he doesn't just speak life into it, he actually breathes his life. He breathes his spirit into man, right? And so we can see from the very beginning that man was created with a very specific original design by God, not just to exist like trees or plants or anything like that, but God specifically created them for a unique purpose. And so we can see that the very first man is Adam, and God sees that Adam isn't good alone, so he creates Eve too. So we see the first man and the first woman. And God gives them this command to go and rule over all the creation, right? To name the different animals, to just have dominion, to govern all of it, to take care of his creation. And while they're doing this, God is also walking among them. That he's not some God in the sky or a God they can just kind of hear. He's a God that they're actually physically walking with in the garden. We often use a word called communion, which basically is just intimate relationship with God. So when everything was created, they weren't separated from God like we are today. They actually were able to walk with him. However, unfortunately, this perfect relationship with God doesn't last forever, as we can see today, right? Because God had given them complete freedom, right? Except for what? Who knows what God said? Do everything except do this. What was it? What tree? Yeah, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Kind of a long name for a tree. Yeah. But basically, they were allowed to eat anything they wanted, right? But he says, but don't touch that tree. You have everything else. Complete freedom, not that one. Don't do it. But did they touch it? Did they eat it? Yeah. So we can see this perfect relationship ends when Eve goes and she eats of the tree, right? Oftentimes, we describe it as an apple. We don't actually know the fruit. It could have been a mango or something that doesn't even exist today. I don't know. But we can see that Genesis 3, chapter 3 is where the story takes place. We can see that this rebellion against God is the origin, it's the starting point of sin in the world. And so through this, we can see that the quest for autonomy or the desire to be independent from God, to say, I don't need you, I can do this on my own. We can see that that choice, that desire of man is a fundamental origin. It is a start of sin. This desire to say, I don't need you, right? And so people often get confused or have question right here, right? If God knew they were going to eat it and sin would enter, why would he give them free will? Why would he let them choose evil? If God is really good, if God is really holy and he really loves his people, why would he let them make such a bad choice? Why does God give us free will? Any ideas? Any thoughts? Why does God give us free will? Yeah, so the free will means we have the freedom to love and choose, right? So the freedom to love and choose means we have the freedom to love and choose God. But at the same time, free will means we have the freedom to not love, to not choose God. Yeah, and so God doesn't want us to live as robots. He doesn't command us, so we have to obey him. He doesn't take over our lives. He doesn't control us like we're a puppet. But he says, I've created you. You have to choose me. And so free will is dangerous. But it's one of the biggest acts of God did for his creation was giving us free will. Because if we have free will, we can choose to actually truly love him. We can choose to follow him regardless of our own situation, regardless of what we want. There's many times where I want to be independent from God, to say, I don't want to do this, Like I live as a missionary, and so actually within my organization, we don't receive any salary. And so I have to connect with churches in America and supporters and live month to month with donations. But I have multiple college degrees. If I wanted to go get a good job, I can get a good job. I speak like 4 different languages. I can get a job anywhere. I'm okay, So for me, I can easily choose to be independent and say, God, I don't need you. I can live my life for myself. But I found so much blessing and so much peace in the fact that I have free will to choose God. And so in the same way, God's given you all the same free will that he gave Adam and Eve, that they were given everything they needed. God said, I will provide everything you need. Just choose me. And they failed to do so. They chose to walk in disobedience. They chose to eat of the fruit. And because of this, we actually see God have to kill an animal, right? And so after they eat of the fruit, they realize they're naked, that they're shameful. They begin to hide from God. They recognize they've done something wrong. And because of this, God actually has to kill an animal to take the fur and cover their sin, to cover their shame, right? And so from the very first sin, we can see this idea, this common symbol and kind of picture that we can see throughout the Bible, this common theme, that blood is required to atone for sin. And so we see that with the very first sin. But alongside the very first sin, we see this verse in Genesis 3:15 that says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He shall crush your head, and you shall strike his heel. So God says, you've sinned. You've fallen away from me. But even in my judgment, there's still hope for redemption. I'm not giving up on you. I still love you. But there are consequences to sin, right? And so this is the first biblical promise of the gospel, actually. that we can see that the woman and the snake, which is a sign of evil, of death, right? For history, they will be against each other. They will be fighting. But there will come a day when the snake strikes the woman's heel, right? He bites the woman's heel. But the woman will, in return, crush his head. She will kill the snake, right? And so in the same way, we know that man, one day, will defeat evil, right? But before that happens, we know there will be a great cost to pay. And spoiler alert, it comes through the life of Jesus, that Jesus will die, that we'll see in the Gospels, for the sins of the people. But then he will raise from the dead. He will defeat death. And so this redemption isn't easy. It's not something that just comes freely. It's something that's going to have to be fought for and something that'll actually have to be won. And so as we move farther into the Old Testament, we'll begin to see this story continue to kind of build into a climax that is reached by the gospel of Jesus. But we need to know that the effect of the fall on all of us isn't that we stop being human. It's not that we're no longer God's creation because we've sinned. God still loves us. We are still created in his image, right? But that image has been tainted, it has been corrupted, it has been stained by sin. And so the way we live our lives, the way we view the world, the way we even view God in our relationship with him has been corrupted, has been broken because of sin. But I don't want us to be confused that, we've lost our humanity, God no longer loves us because of sin, because that's not true. And we can see that in this message of hope, that one day the woman will crush the snake's head, there is redemption, there is hope for mankind. And so as the population of the earth grew, they grew and grew and grew, thousands of people now, right? But one day the sin becomes too great. There's originally only one sin. They chose to rebel against God. But now the land is full of sin. After Adam and Eve are actually kicked out of the garden, God tells them to leave. We see that as the people grow, the population increases, the people become even more evil in the sight of God. So he sent a worldwide flood to destroy all the people. But his judgment wasn't complete and final. He left a remnant. He left a remaining few people, right, to carry on his story of redemption. And we see that through the life of Noah. So he spared the lives of the family of Noah and tasked them with preserving animals and repopulating the earth after the flood. So God flooded the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. And so at this time, everything was destroyed. All of creation was destroyed, except for all those who were with Noah on the ark, on this big boat that he created. And then from Noah, ultimately, we'll see somebody named Abram come about, right? Do some of you guys know who Abram or Abraham is? Yeah? Who is Abraham? Just some random guy in the Bible, right? Not important. You're right. I don't know. Yeah, he's not that important. Yeah, maybe I'll skip him. No. So the rest of the book of Genesis. So the first part of the book of Genesis is all about creation and the fall of man, the entry of sin into the world, and this message of hope. But then after the flood, we begin to see these four major characters come. We see Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, okay? And so these four different people, these four different men, we actually call the patriarchs of the Jewish faith, or basically the fathers of the Jewish faith, right? And so after Noah eventually comes Abraham. And Abraham was just kind of some random guy. He actually wasn't perfect. It was actually known that he killed somebody, so he definitely had sin in his life. But one day when he was living in a land called Ur, or Ur, I'm not sure, God actually speaks to him and says, I want you to follow me to a land that I will give you. And he says, just simply follow me. Leave your people, leave your parents, leave your hometown, follow me. And so in this covenant that God makes with Abraham, this promise he makes with Abraham, in Genesis chapter 15, God promises to make Abram into a great nation, to bless him, to make his name great, to bless all those who bless him and curse all those who curse him. And not just that, not just blessing his own family and him, but also that through his life, all of the nations of the earth will also be blessed. And so this covenant or promise that God makes with Abram, God makes it clear that he has a desire to reverse the effects, to redeem the effects of evil on the world and the judgment that came. And he wants to restore his people back to perfect relationship with him. And we can see through the life of Abraham that he was pretty incredible. He really walked out in faith. When some random God spoke to him that he had never met before, said, "Follow me," Abram didn't, think about it, didn't flip a coin and say, "Heads I go, tails I stay." Nothing like that. He actually says, "Okay, I'll go." And he grabs his family. He begins to follow this God, this voice that is guiding him, right? And Abram and his wife, Sarah, for about 100 years didn't have a kid. But we know that God promised to make Abram into a mighty nation. But how can God make Abram into a mighty nation if he doesn't even have a kid? He has no offspring. And so Abram, is praying, and God says, "Trust me, I will give you a kid." And eventually we see Sarah, his wife, has a baby, and she's like 100 years old or something. So they wait a long time, like 60, 70 years or something like that, for this promise to be fulfilled. But then one day, God tells Abram to go and sacrifice this son, right? The son they had waited decades for, like 60, 70 years, I don't remember exactly. They waited a long time for this son, and now God says, we can see sacrifice of Isaac. God tells Abram, "Go sacrifice your son to me." And so Abraham does it, kind of. He brings Isaac up to a mountaintop, he builds an altar, and he tells his son to get on the altar, and he's ready to kill him, ready to sacrifice him. But then a voice tells him, "Stop. Don't do it." Right? And I prepared something else, and there's like a ram, there's like another animal that Abraham's able to actually bring and sacrifice to God. But can you imagine the faith you would have to have in God to do this, right? That his only son, right, this son that was a gift, that was a fulfillment of a promise that God had made to him, that suddenly God is saying to go and kill him. But for some reason, Abraham did it. To be honest, I don't think I could do it. I love God, but if you told me to sacrifice my son, I could not do that. 100% could not do that. My faith isn't that great. But we can see through this story the faith of Abraham. And actually later on in Paul's letters, we'll actually see this faith recognized as the reason for his salvation. The reason that God is able to carry his redemptive plan through the life of Abraham is because of the faith, this lack of doubt that Abraham actually had in God. So then after Abraham, we have his son Isaac, who he wanted to leave the land of promise, this land that Abraham was living in, and go back to the land of Egypt. But God tells him, "Don't do it, stay, and I'll take care of you." So he ends up staying, and then his son named Jacob comes. And Jacob is not exactly the best son. In their culture at the time, the blessing of the father went to the oldest son. But Jacob is the second son. His older brother Esau is the oldest. So usually the promise or the blessing from the father, the inheritance, would actually go to the oldest son. But we can see in the book of Genesis that Jacob deceives his father. He dresses like Esau, puts on like some animal skin to make him more hairy, because apparently Esau was very hairy. And so he actually goes and receives and steals this blessing from Esau, from his father Isaac. Because of this, Jacob has to flee, but eventually he comes back and reunites with his father, and we see this kind of mini picture of redemption. Even though he had created this sin, he had done this horrible act by stealing this blessing from his brother, we see his father welcome him back and continue this blessing. And then Jacob's son, Joseph, was very famous during this time period. He was actually Jacob's favorite son, and we know this because Jacob gave him this coat of many colors. He was just walking around in this rainbow jacket, basically, which was basically saying, "I'm Dad's favorite, and he loves me more than every one of my siblings." And so obviously, how would you guys feel if one of your parents kept spoiling one of your siblings? Would you be jealous a little bit? Maybe. I would be jealous. I have one older sister, and if my parents gave her everything and me nothing, I would have been very jealous. And so his brothers get really angry at get angry at Joseph, and they end up selling him into slavery. And so they sell their brother Joseph to be a slave in Egypt at the time, which is the biggest kind of world power. They're very strong at this time. And when Joseph is in Egypt, God is with him. He actually blesses him, and he becomes more powerful. And so much powerful, not just, he has a successful business or he has a happy family. Joseph actually becomes like second in command. He's working alongside Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh actually puts him in charge of all of the different storehouses of grain and basically all the food supply. Because at this time, they're in the Middle East, so it's very dry. They don't always have the best, agriculture and plants and things like that. And so at the time, there's famine in the land, so there's a lack of food. People are dying, they're starving. And Joseph is actually the one in charge of protecting all these things and distributing them to the people and making sure that the Egyptians don't die, that they're protected and taken care of. And so during this time, Joseph's brothers actually come to Egypt to get supplies to bring back with them. And Joseph recognizes them, and there's this whole story of, redemption, and there's like this surprise banquet, and Joseph reveals himself and says, "Hi guys, it's me, I'm your brother that you sold into slavery." And of course, his brothers were probably terrified, The guy who could save their lives, they just realized is the same guy they sold to be a slave. But Joseph isn't vindictive. He doesn't try to get revenge for what his brothers did. In fact, he recognizes that God is sovereign, that God put him there for that reason. And so we see the story of redemption take place with Joseph and his family, and Jacob, his father, and all his brothers and the rest of his family actually moved to Egypt. However, that wasn't the best idea, because after Joseph's generation dies, a new Pharaoh comes to power, and he doesn't know Joseph. He doesn't know all the great things that Joseph did. He doesn't realize Joseph is a really good person, and his people are really good people. And so as Joseph's offsprings are growing in Egypt, they become a very large group of people. They're becoming a very large group in Egypt. And so Egypt actually begins to take over and oppress them and make them slaves in Egypt. And so the Israelite people are actually slaves in Egypt for about 400 years, up until the time of Moses. And so because the Pharaoh begins to become concerned about the growing population of Israelites, these offspring of Joseph, he actually creates a law that all the male offspring of the Jewish people, of the Israelites, must be killed. And so Moses is born. He's a male son to an Israelite family, and so he should be killed. So the midwives, when they're helping the mother birth the child, should simply throw them away. But his parents don't want to do that. So the mother actually sends Moses with his sister to the Nile. So Moses is actually sent to the Nile, and Pharaoh's daughter adopts him and brings him into Pharaoh's house, educates him, and things like this. And so Moses, even though he's an Israelite, so Moses was born an Israelite, but he becomes very powerful in Egypt as well. But then Moses encounters God in a flaming bush, a burning bush, and begins to go to Pharaoh and say, "Please let my people go. The God, the creator of everything, has said that my people should be free. I want to take the Israelites back to a land that God has promised us." And so they end up going really fast, right? Pharaoh just simply says, "You're free, you can go." For those who have read the story, is that what happens? Does Pharaoh release them quickly? No, unfortunately not. And so actually, because Pharaoh says, "No, I'm not letting the Israelites go. I need them. They're my slaves. They're building everything. Without them, what are we supposed to do, And so we actually see these things called the 10 plagues. And so through a series of 10 plagues, Pharaoh is confronted with the fact that the Lord is God. So there's a couple of different theories about each of these different plagues and their meanings. But very simply, we can see these different plagues as a way that God revealed his power to the Egyptian people and to the Pharaoh. So for example, at the time, the Nile River, and still today, it was a symbol of like the goddess of life. They believed that all life came from the Nile, that from this place is where people came, that this was the source of life. And so not only did they drink in it, they bathed in it, they also used this water to water all their plants, to feed their different animals and everything like that as well. But the very first plague is that this water is turned to blood. If water is turned to blood, can you use it? No. Can you drink it? Can you take a bath in it? Can you water your plants with it? No. And so, because the water is turned to blood, God shows that he is more powerful than this God of the Nile, right? So he says, life is not from this river, it's from me. And if it's from me, I can also choose to take it away as well. And so the same thing could be said about each of these other plagues, whether it be the frogs coming, or the gnats, or the flies, or the disease on the different livestock, and so on, right? But the final plague is probably the most significant plague that we can look at today, because this plague is the one that ultimately convinces Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go. And so basically what happens is Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, on this night, you need to paint the blood of a lamb over your doorpost. And at that night, the angel of death will pass over. And if there's not blood on your doorposts, then all the firstborn sons of the household will die, right? And so the people go and they sacrifice the lamb, they put the blood over the door, and when they do this that night, the angel of death passes over just like Moses told Pharaoh. And in the morning, in the night even, there's a lot of crying, there's wailing across the land because all the firstborn sons have died. Remember, in their culture, firstborns are very important because they receive the inheritance from their fathers, right? And so for someone like Pharaoh, his kingship, his power would go from him to his son, right? But if his son is dead, who's going to take over for him? And so his heir to the throne, his most important son, the son he's probably spent his whole life raising and championing and training to be the next ruler, is now dead. And so Pharaoh, in this loss, tells Moses, take your people, go, leave. But Pharaoh regrets his decision and sends an army after them as they're crossing the Red Sea, and they all die, all the Pharaoh's army, and the people are able to cross through the Red Sea. Moses holds up his staff, and it goes up, and they walk on dry land. But Pharaoh's army is crushed by the waters when they try to follow and take the people back to Egypt. And so this story of redemption here, of God redeeming the people from their slavery in Egypt and bringing them now on their journey to the land of promise, is once again one of those our moments, right? These redemptive moments that we can see in the Old Testament. And it's really significant in the Jewish culture and the Jewish faith. During the time of the kings and prophets that we'll look at in a minute, this story of redemption from Egypt is something that the people celebrate every year in the festival of the Passover. They recognize that God is their liberator, that he freed them from the land of Egypt, and that they are free and are a people now living in the land that God had promised them because God is their liberator. That through these plagues, through this act of redemption, they can truly see that God is a real God and they should follow him. So as they go from Egypt and they're on their journey to this land of promise that God had given them, it takes not that long, actually. It's not that long of a journey. However, they end up spending a very long time. But after the first 3 months of wandering in the wilderness, the people come to a mountain called Sinai. And there God gave the people the 10 Commandments and a conditional covenant to set them apart and be his holy people, as well as instructions to build a tabernacle or a place of worship so his presence could dwell with them. And so the 10 Commandments are basically these 2 stone tablets that go through these different simple rules that God had given them. Things like, have no other God before me is number 1. So don't worship the other gods of the land, only worship me. There's a law that tells them to honor their mother and father, to not covet or have jealousy or want to take something from somebody else, to not murder somebody. There's 10 of these laws, right? So these 10 laws or commandments, they communicate the values, the core values of God to the people, and how they're meant to live not only with one another, but also how they're meant to view God as well. But one key thing about the 10 Commandments and this season that the people are in as they're journeying from Egypt to the land that God is bringing them to is this idea of holiness. Does anybody know what holy means? Does holy just mean clean? Like I took a bath, I'm holy? What does holy actually mean when it comes to the Bible? Separation, yeah. So holiness is one of the most important characteristics or descriptions of not only God, but also the calling that God has for his people. And this calling, this call to holiness, is a call to being set apart, to be separated, right? And it doesn't mean live in isolation, right? It doesn't mean, hide in your room or anything like that. This call to be set apart means to show the people around them that there's something better to live for, to not follow in the practices of these other nations, to not worship these other gods, but instead to live set apart, to be an example of justice and mercy and love and brotherhood, things like this, to these surrounding nations that they're going to actually encounter in the land. And so this call to holiness is really significant, and it's something that is continuously referenced throughout not just the Old Testament, but also the New Testament as well. And so we can see that people have left Egypt, right? And we often call this the Exodus, which simply means exit, right? So this happens around 1450 BC, and then we can see them receive the Sinai covenant. And then after this event, we can see them actually construct something called the tabernacle. I didn't include a picture of the tabernacle, but basically it's this tent. And in this tent, there's different divisions in this kind of compound, this different kind of thing, where they sacrifice and worship to God. And the very center of this tent, the farthest part, is this place called the Holy of Holies. And this is actually where the Ten Commandments is placed. And God's cloud, his spirit, his presence actually falls on this place. And so this is an image of God actually resting, communing, having relationship with his people. And if we actually look at a map of how the people lived in the wilderness at this time, the tabernacle is right in the middle, and the people lived all around it. And so we can see that the Israelite people, as they're in the wilderness, the tabernacle, this idea of the presence of God, is at the center of their lives. And so as they're in the wilderness, they're on their journey to this land of Canaan, this land that God had originally promised to Abraham, that Joseph and his family had left to go to Egypt. Now God is bringing them back to this land. It's called a land flowing with milk and honey. It's a land that is abundant. It has everything they need. And so God is trying to bring them back to this place, right? But as they come close to this land, they can see it in the distance, right? They say, oh, this is the land that God has called us to. Before they all go, Moses actually sends 12 spies. Because since the people had been gone for 400 years, obviously other people, other nations had begun to live in the land. And so they needed somebody to go and check it out, see what the land is like. Is it really as good as we've been promised? What is it like? What do we need to be prepared for? Things like that. And so these 12 leaders of the Israelites are chosen to go and survey or kind of check out the land, to explore it, and to bring back a report to see what it's like, to share with the people. However, of the 12 people who come back, 10 of them give kind of a false report in a way. I mean, it's true, but it's also not reflecting a faith or trust in God. They say, oh, the people are too big, we can't do it. Oh, the land is so-so, we have a lot of work to do to plant things, and we need to, build a lot of things, and it's just not that good. And so 10 of the 12 people who actually go, they come back and they give not a good report. And their goal was simply to encourage the people not to go. It's going to be too hard, so let's just not do that. But 2 people give a good report, and they encourage the people, it's good, let's do it, God is with us, we can go. And that is Joshua and Caleb. But because these 10 people give bad reports, the people side and trust them, and they begin to become angry at Moses. They begin to become angry at God. They lose their faith. They lose their trust in him, and they begin to complain and basically say, Moses, what have you done? Why have you made us leave Egypt to come to this place to die? I just want to go back to Egypt. I'd rather be a slave than go over there. They're all saying this place is worse than Egypt. Let's just go back and be slaves. And so because of this, the Israelites are sentenced or receive a judgment that none of this first generation, the parents' generation who had left Egypt, none of them will actually get to go into this land of promise. So anybody 20 or older all needs to die before the Israelite people can actually go into the land of Canaan. And so while this journey should have just taken a few months or something, because of their disobedience, their lack of faith that God could actually restore them to the land, because of this, they spend 40 years in the wilderness. But God doesn't forget them. Every night, this kind of flake from heaven falls. It kind of forms kind of like a bread idea on the ground they're able to eat and things like this. They have manna and fish, things like this. And even in the 40 years, their sandals doesn't wear out. They're able to, continue walking for 40 years wearing the same shoes. I've only had my shoes for like a year, and I already need to buy new ones. And I live in Korea. It's not that difficult. So these people are 40 years in the wilderness, walking through the desert. That's not a very easy place to live. But God provides for them all 40 years. And so they spend a long time. And unfortunately, this statement here, Moses at Meribah, happens. And so at one point, the people are thirsty and they're complaining and they're saying, there's been no rain. We need water. We need to drink. And so God says, okay, Moses, go talk to that rock and water will come out. Just go speak, hey, water, come, and the water will come out. But Moses instead hits it with his staff that he carried to walk. And because of this, he didn't completely follow in obedience to what God had called him. Moses is actually punished as well, and God tells him, you will not enter the land of promise either, because you did it by your own strength. Instead of using your words, speaking out my name, you hit the rock. You used your own strength. And for that reason, you will not enter the land of promise. That the person after you will be the one to lead your people into the land of Canaan, the land of promise. And so they finally reach, once again, this edge, the border of the land of promise, the land of the plains of Moab, maybe, on the Jordan River. Just right across this river is the land of promise. And from this place, they're camping, and this is actually where many historical scholars believe that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. So we often call these the Pentateuch, which means 5 scrolls, or the Law of Moses, or the Torah. There's a couple different names. But the last book of the Pentateuch is actually called Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy serves as basically a summary of the first 4 books of the Bible. And so I recommend reading all 5. But if you're short on time and want a quick summary, then read the book of Deuteronomy. It'll cover a little bit of Genesis. It'll go through the law a little bit and things like that as well. And so you can read Deuteronomy. And so it kind of covers all these different things. And so through these different sermons of Moses in the book of Deuteronomy, he begins to shape the worldview. He begins to remind the people of who they are. He begins to tell them that they are created by a very amazing creator God who breathed life into them, that he gave them a calling and a purpose. He reminds them of the calling that God had for Abraham, the promise that he will bring them to a land of promise, and that in this land, he will make them successful and give them everything they need, and he will be their God and protect them, and all these other things. And so the people needed to be reminded of who God is before they go into this land of promise. But one of the main ideas of the book of Deuteronomy is that religion is not a private affair. It's not something you do on your own. It's not something you do just sitting alone by yourself in your room or something like that. Religion is something that involves you, your community, and God as well, and your relationship with him as well. And it's not something that you're meant to simply live out in your own life and how you live, but it's something that's meant to control and guide everything within your community as well. So that way you can truly be a testimony of who God is for your community. Yeah. Any questions so far? Not yet? Yeah. So kind of summary so far. God created everything, but then sin entered. And then he promised Abraham that he will make redemption through his family, that he will bless all nations through him. But after Abraham became Joseph, so the people were slaves in Egypt. And then they were freed from Egypt, and then they were in the wilderness for 40 years. And now God's saying, okay, the land I promised Abraham, now finally, you guys can go into it. Joseph's generation failed to live in the land, but maybe this next generation can have success. And so after Moses dies, we see this man named Joshua take leadership. So the book of Joshua is an account of Joshua's leadership of the people following the death of Moses. So by the Lord's direction, the people cross the river Jordan into the land of Canaan, and there they begin to fight and they begin to take the land from the nations, right? But one important thing that God commanded the Israelite people to do when they go into this land of Canaan is not simply go and live there. he actually commanded them to destroy all the other nations that lived there. And by destroy, I don't mean just saying like, oh, go away, go somewhere else, right? The people are actually commanded to kill all the people, the women, the husbands, the children, everyone. It says in the Bible to commit them to complete destruction. So do not leave anybody alive, right? But this is because the people in the land of Canaan were worshiping many different gods. And it wasn't just like they were sitting, around a campfire, with hot dogs and things like that, singing songs. The gods that they were worshiping were very brutal gods. They were gods that required things like child sacrifice. So people would literally bring their newborn babies and put them on a fire to sacrifice to these gods. And then there was even gods, so there's Baal, who is one of the most well-known gods. And how people also worshipped him was they would actually go before like altars in his image, these statues, and they would, sacrifice their children, and they would also have cult prostitutes. They would just have sex with all these people as a way to worship this god. And so the practices of the people were not innocent. They were very corrupt. They were very evil. And so it can seem kind of crazy that God would tell them to go and kill all these people, right? But through this, we can see how serious God is about holiness, but also how serious he is about loving one another, right? That these different practices, sacrificing your kids is not love. And God wanted to make it very clear that these practices are not allowed. And so the people who are going into the land of Canaan under the leadership of Joshua are commanded to completely destroy these people so that all these wicked practices could not continue. If you delete all the people who practice these things, if you destroy all of them that practice these things, then hopefully these practices cannot be continued. That's the idea. It can sound really unjust. It can sound really mean. Oh, God's so angry. He hates people. It's not that. God just really, really, really loves people and is against anything, any practice that is in opposition to that love. And so we can see that through this command that God gives his people as they enter the land of Canaan. So as the people go into Canaan, we see these different battles. And if they're following God in obedience, like in Jericho, God actually tells them to circle the city for 7 days and blow trumpets, to not, just try to attack the city themselves, but to trust God to fight for them. And so the city of Jericho had these really tall walls. So from our own perspective, it makes sense. Okay, if there's, a lot of people coming, then we can just simply go and attack the wall, break it down, right? Easy, and then go inside, take over. But God says, no, don't do that. Just walk around for 7 days, blow your trumpet. And when they blow the trumpet on the 7th day, all the walls fall. And so they go in, they're able to actually take over. And so we can see that when they walk in obedience, even if it doesn't really make sense, just walking around the city and then blowing a trumpet, the walls will fall, that doesn't make sense. But when the people walk in obedience to this, we can see they receive victory. And so through the book of Joshua, we can see a lot of different instances where the people receive victory when they're obedient, but when they're disobedient and try to do it in their own strength, we see they fail because God is not on their side if they're not walking in obedience to him. And so by the end of the book of Joshua, the Israelites, through many successes and some failures, are finally living in the land. Finally, the land that was promised to Abram's descendants has become a reality. His people are once again living there. God has redeemed them, right? So the stage is set. There's a foundation laid that finally God's people can live in the land, that they can follow his laws, they can be obedient to him, they can love one another well. And if they love one another well, then they can be a testimony to these other nations of what it looks like to live in communion, to live in relationship with the God of creation. And that hopefully through their lives, other people can also know God, right? However, what we find out is that even though they're living in the land, they got a little bit lazy and they didn't actually destroy all the nations that were living there. And so because of this, these evil practices of these different nations continues on. And so slowly over time, we see that evil, this idea of apostasy or worshiping false idols, continues to happen in the land of Israel after Joshua's generation. And so we've seen so far, there were very clear leaders, right? We have Abraham, right? And we see his son, and then we see his son, and so on, right? We see these very clearly placed leaders all the way until we have Joshua after Moses, right? But after Joshua dies, there's not one leader. They're actually divided into these different tribes, and they have their different leaders over these different 12 tribes that help to govern the people as they grow. And so the book of Judges actually begins by noting that, or highlighting that Joshua's people, when they moved into the land, they didn't destroy everybody. And so the Lord actually declares judgment. He says, because you did not destroy everybody, he will not drive out. He will no longer be on their side to destroy these other nations. And that because these other nations are living amongst them, these different practices will lead the people away from God. And so this is where we get into this thing called the cycle of the judges. And so we can look here. And so like I said, there's no specific one leader at the time like Joshua. But instead, as the people are living in the land and the other nations are influencing them to walk against God, they begin to sin. They begin to worship these different false idols. They begin to lose success in victories. Other nations begin to conquer them and oppress them because of their sin. God is no longer on their side. And so we can see this idea of opposition following sin. But then suddenly the people realize, this is all happening because we've been disobedient. So they call out to God. They say, God, we are so sorry. We recognize we've done something wrong. Please save us. Please redeem your people. And so God does this through people called the judges, who are basically these military deliverers. So these kind of military leaders who would actually come and destroy the opponents and restore peace to the land. And so we see this cycle. It happens over and over. I think there's 13, 14 judges mentioned in the Old Testament. And so we see this cycle happen 13, 14 different times, where the people have peace, and then they sin again, get oppressed, other nations are attacking them, they call out to God, God raises up a judge, restores them back to peace, and so on. But each time there's peace, it becomes shorter and shorter and shorter. And so the time in between peace and oppression becomes shorter. And so the people are really struggling in the land. And one of the last major judges, or the last judge really, that's really highlighted in the Old Testament is somebody named Samuel. And so Samuel was a Nazarite, so he was from the tribe of Nazarene, so there's 12 different tribes of Israel at this time. And he's a very kind of charismatic leader. And he's interesting because he also acts kind of like a prophet. We can actually call him not only the last judge, but also the first prophet. And so he boldly leads the people of Israel back to victory, back to peace, and restores them back to covenant relationship with God and things like this. But his sons that take over after him were not very good leaders. They're pretty dumb, apparently, and the people are not satisfied, and they begin to look at all these different nations. So Israel at this point has only ever had judges randomly, kind of, throughout their history. They've never had one leader, a really clear governance, right? But all the nations around them have a king. And so they begin to ask Samuel, the judges aren't enough. We need a king to lead us. We need somebody to really commit their lives to protecting our people and guiding us. And so Samuel tells him, you don't need a king, you need God. You don't need that. But the people still complain, and so Samuel goes before God and says, God, these people, they want a king. They don't want only you, they want a king. And God warns against it. He says, if you have a king, they're going to oppress the people, they're going to steal all their money, all their food. It's not going to be a blessing, But the people still say, we want a king. And so ultimately, Samuel ends up anointing or proclaiming that Saul is the first king over the Israelite people. And God is faithful to his people. Even though he didn't desire for them to have a king, he still gives them a lot of victory under this new king, Saul. And so Saul begins his kingship really faithfully. He's walking well with God. He's walking in obedience. But slowly, as he gets older, he begins to be unfaithful. He offers bad sacrifices. He begins to take on too much power. and just these other things. And so actually, God's blessing over Saul is removed, and Samuel anoints a guy named David to become king over the Israelite people. And David was not anything special. He was a very simple guy. He was just living his life, being a shepherd and everything like that. And then one day in a battle, he kills a giant with a slingshot. And then Samuel anoints him as king over the Israelite people. And he becomes, I would say, arguably the most famous king of the Israelite people during this period. And so, we can see, the reign of Saul. Then we can see that David is anointed king, and then there's this fighting or tension between Saul and David for a period of time until Saul dies and David becomes the main king of Israel. And so, even though David wasn't really faithful at all times, he ends up having an affair with a beautiful woman that he finds, and after that he has her husband killed, and then he begins to take on too much power. He does some kind of crazy things. He definitely walks in disobedience to God. However, after these times of disobedience, he recognizes that he has sinned, and he returns to God in repentance. And so we'll see that a lot of the different kings are actually compared to David, and it's not because he was perfect. A lot of the kings are actually compared to David because of his repentance and his heart of worship to God. And so that's really where David's kind of blessing as a king comes from, is this relationship and this heart of repentance that he carried before the Lord. And because of this, God actually makes a very significant covenant with David. He tells him in 2 Samuel chapter 7 that your house and your kingdom will endure forever before the Lord, and your throne will be established forever. And so he says, David, from your line, there will always be a king on the throne. You don't have to worry. No other king from a different tribe will take over. From your line, from your offspring, your people will always have a king. And so we're going to talk more about covenants tomorrow, but basically David's covenant said that God promised to make David's name great, that he will provide a place of safety and refuge for God's people. He will give them rest, that they'll have peace from their enemies, and so on and so forth. And so, David was a pretty good king, and towards the end of his life, he decides he wants to build a tabernacle or a temple to God. So up until this point, they only had the tent, right, where they're worshiping God. But David says, I want to create a real place of worship, a place with brick and stone that can last for generations for people, all of our people, to come and worship the Lord, the creator of everything, right? And so he says he wants to create this temple of the Lord, but a prophet at the time named Nathan actually comes and tells him, unfortunately, it will not be you, but it will actually be your offspring, your son, who will build the temple of the Lord. And so his son will actually come, and his name is Solomon. And Solomon, does anybody know why Solomon was famous? Rich? Oh. Wisdom? Was he wise? Yeah, Solomon was very wise. So when Solomon becomes king, God, tells him, I can give you anything you want. What do you want? And Solomon doesn't say, I want all of the gold. I want the biggest house. I want to live forever. He doesn't say that. Solomon very humbly just simply asks God for discernment, for wisdom on how to be a good king. When Solomon becomes king, he's not concerned about all of these worldly things, having the most money or the nicest house or anything like that. He just simply wants to be a faithful king who leads God's people well. And even in the life of Solomon, in the book of 1 Kings, we can actually see a few different stories of Solomon's wisdom. And one of my favorites, is kind of sad, but it's also really amazing at the same time. And it actually involves two prostitutes. And so these two women both had children, and one night they're sleeping, and one of them rolls over, and one of the babies dies in the sleep. And so now only one baby is still living. And so they begin to fight over this baby, right? And they say, no, this one's my baby. No, this one's my baby. And so they go before Solomon, and they're like, and so Solomon's told to choose who gets custody, who gets to keep the baby. And Solomon says, oh, easy. Cut the baby right in half. Just cut the baby in half. Half goes to this mom, half goes to this mom. Both happy, There's only one baby, but 2 moms, so each mom gets half a baby. Done. Easy, right? But what happens next really reveals the wisdom that Solomon had at the time. The true mom says, oh, no, don't do that. Just give her the baby. I don't care. Just give her the baby. Let my baby live. And Solomon says, you're the real mom. Because only a true mother would make that kind of sacrifice for her child. And so through that, we can see that Solomon was really wise. And because of this event, Solomon's wisdom became known to all the nations around them, And so Solomon began his time as king really successfully. He, like Nathan the prophet had told David, Solomon is the one to build the temple of God. And when he builds the temple of God, he actually brings the Ark of the Covenant, which is this kind of special box that held the 10 Commandments in it. And that when he brings this special piece into the temple, God's presence actually like a cloud falls and fills it. And so once again, God is amongst his people. The people know for sure that God is with them. It's this beautiful picture of God redeeming relationship once again with his people. But unfortunately, like his father, who started off well, but then when he got older, began to not have as much success and began to walk in disobedience, Solomon also falls away from God. And how he falls against God is actually in a way that we'll see a lot through the Old Testament, and we call it synchronism. And basically this meant that he was worshiping God, but alongside God, he was worshiping these other gods of the other nations as well. And so at the time, like on the different high places, like on the mountains and things like this, they worshipped Baal, who was the god who they had to sacrifice their children to. Solomon was also worshiping God there as well. And so these 2 places of worship began to get mixed, and people began to worship God in not good ways. They began to just combine them all into one religion, basically. And we call that synchronism. And so as he begins to do this, he begins to fall away from God. He begins to get many wives and different kind of concubines, or like kind of different women that he could sleep with and things like this. I think like over 1,000, like a lot of women. And not just women he gets, but he also becomes very wealthy. He takes a lot of gold. He increases the army. He has the most horses of any other kingdom. He begins to really build up these worldly things, right? So at the beginning of his reign, he was only concerned about wisdom. But by the time of the end of his kingship, he's concerned about all these other things that God never intended for him. And so because of his unfaithfulness, a prophecy comes to Solomon and says, because of your disobedience, because you've fallen apart from me, I will split the kingdom. I will split the Israelite people into 2 different kingdoms. And so we see that Solomon dies, and his son Rehoboam actually becomes king in his place. And Rehoboam is very young and not as wise as his father. And there becomes an issue where the people are complaining, saying, the king, your people are putting too much pressure on us. It's too hard. Please make our lives a little bit easier. We need help. Please help us. And so instead of going to the wise elders for advice, he actually listens to his friends group, his own peers, who tell him, they want it to be easier? No, make it harder. How dare they ask to make it easier? And so Rehoboam makes their lives harder, and because of this, a rebellion happens, and the kingdom actually splits into 2. And so just like the prophecy to Solomon had said, the kingdom is split into 2. So from here on out, the northern kingdom is known as Israel. And so 10 of the tribes actually move and follow the king to Israel. And then only 2 tribes, Benjamin and Judah, actually stay in Judah. And so Rehoboam, so David's line stays in Judah, and another king named Jeroboam goes to the northern place called Israel and puts the capital at Samaria. So the capital of Judah is Jerusalem, capital of Israel is Samaria. And so, So we see that God's perfect plan for the people to be united, to be having good relationship with one another, to be a testimony of God's goodness over them to all the nations around them, we see that now there's a civil war and they're splitting apart. And so we see this redemption that God had really aimed for is now once again breaking apart really clearly. And so as we kind of look at the different kings, we're not going to go into all of them, but just know there's 39 kings between Israel and Judah. So in the southern kingdom of Judah, there were 19 kings, and of the 19 kings, 6 are considered to have done right or done well or obeyed the commandments well and followed God, while the other 13 did not do well, basically. And then in Israel, as we can see by all of the red, none of them were considered good. And so basically, in the southern kingdom, they were considered good if they followed after David and what he had done, walking in obedience to God. And they were considered bad if they did not follow after David's ways. And then in the northern kingdom, they were considered good if they were just considered bad all. So they were considered bad if they did what Jeroboam did and did not walk in obedience to God. And so because of this, Israel became very wicked, and it is noted that, there was no king in Israel that was good. But if we go back to the timeline a little bit, we begin to see God begin to try to restore his people back to obedience and faithfulness to him, because the kings aren't doing a good job. There's 39 kings, and only a few of them were considered good. And so God begins to send these people called prophets. And so the first 2 major prophets we actually see are Elijah and Elisha. And so through the lives of these 2 prophets, it is shown that the Lord is the Lord of his people, of every aspect of their lives, and the whole creation. And so their main focus is to guide the people back to God, that recognizing there's evil in the land, but God wants them to return. And so they begin to deliver these different words of hope, these words of conviction, and calling the people back to being obedient to the covenant and obedient to God. However, the prophets ultimately don't succeed in their mission, in their goal to return the people back to God. And the northern kingdom, so Israel, due to their long history of idol worship and disobedience to God, and their lack of repentance, are carried into exile by the hands of the Assyrians, who are a surrounding nation, who are the major world power at the time. And so when we see them taken into exile, we need to know that the Assyrian exile was very brutal. The people were scattered across the region. They were killed, they were murdered, they were raped. Really bad situation. And so it can also once again begin to make us ask the question, is God good? Is he bad? Did God abandon his people? Like, if God really loved his people, how could he let them be taken away from the land of promise, right? But the narrator makes it really clear that the Lord has punished the northern kingdom because of their disobedience to the covenant. That God had repeatedly, through the prophets, warned the people to return to him, to return in repentance, to follow the covenant once again. And if they didn't, they would be punished. And so we can just simply see that it's not about God being good or not. We can just see that God actually told them that there is a punishment coming if they do not return to him. And so God is portrayed throughout the Old Testament as moving slowly and regretfully toward judgment. He's not moving quickly. It's not one sin that ends in this punishment. It's generations of sin that actually leads to this punishment. And so the Old Testament actually bears witness to God's patience, his faithfulness, and his mercy towards his people. And even in the book of 2 Chronicles, we see there's this statement that says, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and will heal their land. And so God very clearly makes it known to the people that if you return to me, if you repent, if you walk in obedience to me once again, punishment will not happen. I will restore you. I will redeem you as I have promised. And so, unfortunately, the people are brought into exile. Israel first goes to Assyria. And later we'll see Judah goes to Babylon as well. And so, like I mentioned, we have Elijah and Elisha, who are these 2 prophets at the time. And so there's different roles of the prophet we can look at, but 4 that we can kind of talk about is first being God's spokesman. And so today we have the Holy Spirit, where we can hear God's voice, right? we can feel God's presence in our lives, things like that. At their time, they didn't have that. Not everybody had this God spirit, kind of thing. So instead, God spoke to these very specific people at the time to be his spokesman or his messengers. And so their job was simply to deliver the words of God to his people. And then the words that they're delivering are two different versions, kind of thing. There's two different kind of topics. The first one being rebuking them, basically, saying, you're sinning, return to God. And then the second one being a message of hope, that if you return to him, there will be redemption. But if you don't, there will be judgment, and then redemption. Either way, redemption will come, but you can choose if you want the hard way or the easy way of redemption, basically. And so they also taught the people about morals and the law and teaching them how to live well and showing them how God has called them to live. And then, like I said, they're also prediction. So not like, fortune tellers or anything like that, like we have today, but they proclaim judgment and these messages of hope that would happen in the future. And so we can actually see kind of these two different major divisions of prophets, the early prophets and then the later prophets. And so in the southern kingdom, so in Judah, under the king Hezekiah, we can actually see this kind of message of hope. Hezekiah was one of the good kings who began to restore the people back to obedience to God. And then after Hezekiah was a guy named Josiah, and Josiah was also a really good king. So during the time that Josiah was king in Judah, he's restoring the temple. It's kind of old at this point, and so they needed to do some work to restore it, clean it up, fix it, things like that. And when they're doing this, they actually uncover some scrolls of the law that had been lost before. And when Josiah's reading it, he recognizes the people are sinning, they're being disobedient. And so he brings it before the people and restores them back to covenant obedience. He tears down the high places so they're no longer worshiping God alongside the other gods of the different nations that surrounded him and things like that. And so we can see that Josiah was a really good king who was able to restore the people back to covenant obedience. And so through Hezekiah, Josiah, and some of the other good kings, we see these messages of hope that, even though there's sin happening, maybe there's still hope, that even though Israel has been taken to captivity, maybe there's still hope for the people of Judah, that God will not punish all his people, only those who were in Israel. And so that's the hope. However, the people fall back into sin as soon as an unrighteous king takes power. And so King Zedekiah was the last king of Judah, and he was not obedient to God. And during his reign, Babylon, who is a new world power after Assyria, actually comes, takes over the land, and brings all the people from Jerusalem into the land of Babylon. And so, it was really a very difficult time for the people, for sure. And there's many different prophets we could look at. But overall, I want to just simply look at some of the messages of hope. So there's a lot of messages of judgment to come, but more than that, I want us to think about hope. And so, for example, Ezekiel in chapter 36 says that I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And so we can see this idea that even though the people are living by a law that is written on stone, on the two different stone tablets, the Ten Commandments, right, and all these other laws that were given to Moses at the time, that there will come a day where they're not following a law that is written on stone, but a law that's written on their hearts instead, a very intimate, a very personal law. And not just that, but Ezekiel sees this image of all these different dry bones in this valley with God's Spirit being breathed over them. They come back to life. And so we can see that God will take what is broken, what is dead, and restore it back to life once again. We can also see in Jeremiah that he promises them that the judgment, the coming exile to the people will not be permanent, but actually it'll just last about 70 years, and that after this time, God will restore the people back to the land. And then in Daniel, we see that Babylon, the world power that's taking over Judah at the time, will not last forever, that God will also bring punishment against them. And so we can see just consistently throughout the prophets that God promises redemption for his people. And so it's really beautiful. when you think about it. Yeah, there's so many prophets. I could go through each one, but we don't have time. But one important one we should look at is Isaiah. So Isaiah was during the early prophet period. And so Isaiah highlights to the people of Israel that God had offered them rest, salvation, and strength, but the people would not accept it and instead craved worldly security. So fighting for themselves when they were being threatened instead of really trusting in God. And so he tells them that they will receive judgment, but he also tells them that God will bring restoration to them. And there's two major messages of hope that Isaiah highlights. The first one being that their restoration will come at the hands of a suffering servant. And so through the book of Isaiah, we see that a suffering servant would come amongst their people to save, redeem, and restore them back to the perfect image that God had originally designed for them. And also, we see something kind of random in the book of Isaiah, that some guy named Cyrus will come and he will bring restoration to them as well, that he will be God's tool or method for bringing the people back to the land. And so we see really a lot of different messages of hope. Yeah, so this is actually one of the visions of the king that Daniel was working with at the time. So Daniel's taken into exile, and this king keeps receiving all these different visions. And Daniel has a gift of interpretation, so he begins to interpret these different visions for the king. And this vision we'll actually see come to fruition or being fulfilled through the time period between the end of the Old Testament and the period of the New Testament. And so we can see that there's like a head of gold, the chest and arms of silver, and then the belly and thighs of bronze, and the legs, and then there's this stone. And so it's actually a prophecy concerning the 4 different kingdoms that are going to rule over the land over the coming years. So, like I said, so all the people of Israel and Judah had been taken into exile. So Israel was taken into Assyria, but then Assyria was conquered by Babylon. And then Babylon took over Judah and took all the people into exile as well. And so once again, the people had been taken from the land of promise. So we saw them in Egypt, right, first, and now we see them once again taken from their land. But then, once again, we see another picture of redemption, of restoration. So about 70 years of exile happened. And in 539 BC, King Cyrus of Persia comes to power and releases all of the Israelite people to return to their land. So the people return to the land actually under a guy named Zerubbabel, who is actually a direct descendant of David. And he goes alongside a guy named Jeshua, who is of the line of Aaron, who is a high priest at the time. And their plan is to rebuild the altar and restore worship, things like that, back in the land. And so we actually see these 3 different returns. So we see the first one under Zerubbabel, the second one under Ezra, and the third one under Nehemiah. And then with each of these returns, we can see these kind of major symbols of the Jewish faith restored. And so under Zerubbabel, the altar is restored. And the altar is a symbol of sacrificial offering and worship to God. This is where they literally sacrificed animals to God, right? They had to atone for their sins, things like this. The temple was also built under Zerubbabel. However, we see that the description of this temple is nowhere near as good as the temple under Solomon. Like I mentioned before, God's cloud, his spirit, his presence actually filled the temple of Solomon, right? However, we don't see that with Zerubbabel's temple at all. We don't see God's spirit return to live and preside amongst his people. And then when Ezra comes in the second return, he brings back the law and restores the people back to covenant obedience. And then under Nehemiah, we see the third return, and he actually begins to restore the city. So he begins to rebuild the different walls and things like this, protecting the city and redefining the land. And so the people are living in the land once again, but under Ezra and Nehemiah both, we begin to see, just like before, just like during the period of the judges, just like in the period of the kings, the people are once again falling back into the cycle of sin. And so they begin to marry wives from other nations. Therefore, they begin to worship the other gods of the other nations. They begin to dishonor the temple. They begin to work on the Sabbath, which was a day that God had commanded the people in the wilderness to take to rest and remember all his faithfulness and all that he had done. And the people are just living in sin once again. And so even though Ezra and Nehemiah both try to restore the people back to covenant faithfulness, to being obedient to God, the people are still really broken, and they really need somebody to actually come to fulfill the law and restore them back to the image that God had created for them. But this time period, like we can see in Solomon's temple, was not good. Solomon's temple wasn't good. Zerubbabel's temple was not as good as Solomon's. The people are living in sin. Once again, there's a bunch of different nations living around them. They're always at threat. There's no peace. And they're waiting for a Messiah to come to actually take over, to give them victory and restore them back to God's people. So by the end of the Old Testament, the future of the Israelites remains uncertain. Israelites are back in the land, but even with the temple built, its existence as a nation is not without tension and instability. And so the question has to be asked, is God still with his people? How will he fulfill his promises, right? So because of the words of the prophets, though, like we already talked about, we do know that there is hope, that God has not forgotten his people, but we're not sure exactly how he's going to fulfill it, right? And so that's all we have time for, I guess, today, because I don't want to start New Testament. But basically, big overview of the Old Testament is that God had created everything perfect. Because of sin, it was broken. And the stories of the Old Testament are stories of God's faithfulness, even when God's people are not faithful. We see this constant cycle of sin, that the people can never fully live in obedience to God's law because it's too hard. There are too many laws, there's too many things for them to have to do to remain in this close relationship with God. And because of this, man is not good enough, that they need somebody to come and actually fulfill the law, so that way they don't keep falling back into the sin cycle that they've been living in for generations and generations and thousands of years. And so that's the overview overall of the Old Testament as we wait for the coming redemption that all the prophets promised.